and announce the two topics we're going to be talking on tonight are topics that are rather sensitive in nature, and I tell you, I don't know much how to talk about it without talking about it. So I'm going to be pretty plain tonight, and my intent is not to be vulgar, but to be clear. So I'm going to use some terms that we traditionally do not use in pulpits, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, and hopefully will not be offensive to anyone in the things that we'll have to say. I'd like to begin tonight with this first presentation, which talks about sex in the Bible. You have the outline. There's such a wealth of information, and that would just start to introduce you to some of the sexual things that are spoken of in the Scriptures. I'm going to be looking at this in just a little bit of detail as we go through the lesson tonight. But since you have those verses, I may not go into all of those in order to afford us time for a couple of other things that somewhere I need to squeeze in this weekend so we get the full picture here. It is good to see you out tonight, and I invite you to join with us now to study the Scriptures on sex in the Bible. I want to begin by saying this, that while the Bible is not primarily a sex book, it does give us sexual instruction. And those times when God touches on this subject in the Scriptures, God is very clean, very open and forthright about these matters. As a matter of fact, as I put this material together, I became more and more impressed with the fact that God's divine grace has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. 2 Peter 1, verse 2 through 4. Now, I want to speak kind of plainly tonight, and in some ways I may just be a little bit more folksy than usual, but we'll kind of test that as it goes. But what I would like to ask you is, how did you learn about the facts of life? I'm not asking you for an answer verbally, but I'd like you to answer that in your mind. How did you learn about the fact that there's men and women and that there's sexual things that occur between a man and his wife, or can occur in perversion or outside of a context of marriage? How did you learn about that? And I want to suggest to you that as I go about asking that question, what I find a lot of times is most Christians don't learn about that in any kind of traditional way. You know where we're getting our answers? From the world. And it's no wonder that because we're getting our answers from the world, that we start off real early in life with sexual experimentation. We start off very early in life with sexual confusion. We start off early in life with the idea of using women as sex objects from some magazine or some film we found in the shower room, or somebody was passing around, or sticking in a locker. We learn that we may learn from the world or from our experience that sexual things are somewhat dirty and that we need to talk about those in a whispering context. And so it's kind of a secret. But it really isn't a secret. And what I also note is the absence of. When I ask Christian parents or Christian families, how did you all learn about sex, about sexual information, what I am told is that they didn't learn it from mom and dad, because I'll ask them, did your mom and dad have the talk with you? And if they do answer that yes, then what they'll say is, well, the talk was kind of more embarrassing to mom and dad than it was to me. And I really didn't get a lot of information, and what I did sounded pretty bizarre. And so it awakened the curiosity, and they went out to the world to find the answers. But more often than not, what I get is I wasn't told. In terms of females, as females go into their womanhood, and as they go through a first monthly, sometimes I get this statement that, well, I was just handed this little wrapper and told this is what women do. I have no clue how to deal with sexuality, and just kind of figure it out as you go. And it's no wonder that we have some of the epidemic that we have not only in the world, but especially that we have in the church. And when the Bible is so open and so clear on the subject of sexuality, and that's what I want to talk with you about tonight, that the Bible is very clear about this, and in the beginning I want to suggest that sexuality is not a dirty thing. It can be made dirty by the devil and by those who dare to pervert God's intended plan. In the very beginning, God made man and woman, and He made them with gender differences. I want to cite that in the very beginning. He made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And so we have a male and a female, and God actually performed the first marriage ceremony when He brought the woman to the man and said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken from man." And then He talks about a man leaving his father and mother and cleaving to his wife, and the two being one flesh. That's sexual, right in the very beginning. And so what God saw is it was not good for a man to be alone. In Genesis 2 and verse 18, God said that. And guys, you need to listen. When God says it's not good for you to be alone, it's not good for you to be alone. God has made, in the realms of marriage, has made a counterpart to man. Not an equal in terms of equal physically and anatomy-wise, but a counterpart where the two come together and but they're made to fit each other. Not only in terms of sexuality, but in terms of temperament and different dispositions. Men approach things differently than women, and women approach things differently from men. And therefore, there is kind of that give and take. There's a balance that takes place there. God made humans, male and female, as well as He did the animals. He commanded man and woman that they were to multiply and replenish the earth. So the intent of God from the beginning was procreation. There would be some that would dare to even suggest that the very first sin was sexual awakening. And I don't see anywhere in the Garden of Eden where that was even the case at all. But in some of the literature that you read, and some of the distortions of the world, you'll find people saying that. But the Bible tells us that God made man and woman. He made man and woman so they could reproduce and cohabit. And that's in Genesis 1, verse 22 and 28. The first sin that was ever committed resulted in man and woman being aware of their nakedness and also some shame that goes with nakedness. In Genesis 2 and verse 25, the implication is that with nakedness should come shame. Adam and Eve hid themselves in the garden because they were naked. God asked them, "Who told you were naked?" I'll tell you what, I almost wish we could find the fruit from that tree, because some folks going around today don't know they're naked. They wear themselves and show themselves in such a way that they're just putting on an advertisement. In my work, I have a field unit with some IUPUI students, and each semester I sign off on about 12 to 20 of those students for their internships. And one of the things that I have to share with the young women that come aboard, and the young men, but the young women primarily are asking this question, and what they say is, "What's your dress code here?" And what I tell them very clearly is, if you put it on display, folks are going to look at it. So if you don't want to look at it, hide it. And if you'll follow that as your dress code, you'll be okay here. But if you put things on display, don't be surprised when it becomes a topic and when people begin to look at you in such a way that you're a sex object. I share that with them, and I think probably some of them didn't have mothers even that told them that. But we need people that will say that, and that will guide our young people in what is appropriate and modest dress. The Bible talks about modest dress, modest apparel. In the beginning, there was a shamedness or an embarrassment that Adam and Eve had because they were naked. And I want you to notice something here about their clothing. They attempted to make some clothes out of some leaves, which we know leaves aren't going to last long when they're detached from their vines. And God then made them the first clothes, in which He calls aprons, in Genesis 3, verse 7 through 21. And the purpose of that was to hide their nakedness. And we need to be very aware that nakedness is something that should be reserved for a man and his wife. We are not sex objects to be flaunted and to tease with anybody that wants to look at us. Contrary to what the magazines and the various media would portray. During the time of the flood, there were pairs that were taken into the ark, and they were taken there so that when they left the ark, they could procreate and the earth could be replenished. There was an incident in Genesis, the 9th chapter. By the way, I'm going through the whole Bible tonight in this lesson. But in Genesis 9, verse 20 through 27, we read about a case of sons that looked on their father's nakedness. And while I look at that, there's not a great deal in that one verse, or that little section of verses. But Genesis 9, verse 20 through 27, there's a reason God put that in there. And my thought on that is there's more that was not put in there for whatever reason, but that it was gone over. And there what we find is that Ham, one of Noah's sons, saw his father naked. And evidently that was a shameful thing. And the other two sons backed up with a cloth and put the cloth over their naked dad. And when Noah found out that Ham had looked on his nakedness, the text says there was a curse that went on Ham because of that. And I want to suggest to you that if for no other reason than just to be on the safe side, as we read that text, we need to be careful about our nakedness around our families. I'm finding more and more people that say, oh, I shower with my kids, or I bathe with my kids. I'm talking about Christian folks. And while that may be something done when kids are very young, and memory's not real great for them for future, while that may be something people do, I want to tell you what, that has devastating consequences when that is done as children get older and older and older. And when we've got 9, 10-year-olds bathing with their mom and dad, sometimes the opposite genders bathing or showering together, and those things ought not to be, my brother, because that's the stuff that sets us up for all kinds of problems in the home, incestuous stuff. And also with the issues that we've got in our culture with blended families, where we may have a perfectly legitimate second marriage, but we may have children that are from other marriages. And we need to be careful about nudity and about sexual expression in our homes, about walking in on each other. Because there's something here about viewing people's nakedness, that there are some things that are private. And that is exactly, I believe, some of the lessons that we can learn here from Noah and from the curse that he placed upon his son. First case of homosexuality is described in Genesis, the 13th chapter, verses 12 through 13, verses 12 and 13, and then the 19th chapter. And if you'll notice in that, when I first looked at that, I thought, well, Sodom and Gomorrah were horrible cities, and the people from Sodom would call them Sodomites for a reason, because they were homosexual. But if you want to look at that real closely in your context, if you'll notice it wasn't 1 or 2 cities that were under destruction, there were 7 cities of the plains that were targeted for destruction by Almighty God. And the reason is because their sin, the cry of their sin, had gone up before heaven. That whole area appears to me to have been saturated with homosexuality. And there was not enough righteousness in that entire region to save those cities, until Lot and his 2 daughters got to 2 of the cities out there. And if you'll notice, there were only 5 cities destroyed, not 7. And there were 2 evidently spared, because when they got there, there was 10 righteous souls. Read that and see if that is what it says. Interesting little sidebar there. But homosexuality was certainly condemned in the Scriptures, as these men burned in their lust one for another. The first case of someone having sexual relations with their handmaiden is in Genesis 16 and verse 4. Circumcision was adopted as the token of the covenant between God and Abraham, and it was carried all the way over into the New Testament, where with the Jewish people, where they practiced circumcision as a religious ritual. As a matter of fact, it became a great topic of discussion in the New Testament church, and even resulted in a conference being called in Acts the 15th chapter to determine, do you have to be circumcised as a Jew? Do the males have to be circumcised as Jews in order to become Christians? That was an issue in the church. I wondered sometime, how on earth would you ever know if somebody is circumcised or not? And evidently they did. And then as I got to looking at that, I think the answer to that is they had public bathhouses back then. And so the guys went down to the bathhouse. They didn't have bathrooms at home like we do. And they'd go down, they'd be showering together, and I guess they were checking each other out part of the time. At least enough to know if you're circumcised or not circumcised. And that's how, I think, how folks found that out. But in Genesis, the 38th chapter, verse 9 and 10, by the way, if you're one given to masturbation, you will look at that verse, because that's exactly a verse that you need to be very familiar with, because it tells us a man named Onan was killed by God because he spilled his seed on the ground. And what it says there is that he did that because he didn't want to raise up children to his brother. So we've got a cross between the Old Testament and we've got a sexual act that takes place. And God was very displeased with what Onan did. And as a result, the man was struck dead. The first case of rape that I was able to find in the Bible is in Genesis, the 34th chapter, verses 2 through 31. And there we have the rape of Dinah and the injustice that is perceived by the brothers who go out and hunt down the fellow that did it. I want to suggest to you in that, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, is that family protects family, and that we need to watch out after our sisters, out of our family members, and if those people in our family aren't protecting themselves from sexual immorality, then family members have an obligation to step in there and tighten up the reins a little bit, because family sticks together. And we don't go out and let our family members be exploited. There was unlawful marriage talked about in the law of Moses by the time we get to the book of Leviticus. And in this we find that anybody closer than your first cousin, you were forbidden to marry. That didn't come in until the law of Moses. And then we also find that there were penalties for incest. If we had people that were committing incest, I want you to look at God's consequences on that. If we've got people that had no right to be married, or had no right to be married, but were committing sexual act outside of marriage, then the penalty for that was death for both parties. Now, I'll tell you what, that put an end to a lot of stuff real quick, because it was the death penalty. Now, how strongly is God against immorality? How strongly is God against incest? You don't have to read very far to find out that if the death penalty is what God required, that God wanted a very clear message sent that you just don't do this. In terms of other unlawful intercourse, sexual intercourse, the Bible talks very clearly about a woman in her uncleanness. Now what that's talking about is during a monthly cycle, and it's also talking a little later on about sexual activity after the birth of a child, and in that case it was 40 days, and there had to be a cleansing that took place before sexual relations were to resume. But during the time of a woman's time of the month, there was, it's off limits. Doors closed. And Leviticus 19 and chapter 20, verse 18, you had those verses there to look for. In the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, adultery was wrong, and the penalty for adultery was death. I'll tell you what, we wouldn't even have the marriage question today, marriage, divorce, and remarriage, if we lived under the law of Moses. You wouldn't have to worry about that. And so we wouldn't have to be arguing over what the New Testament says about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. If you did that under the Old Testament, tell you what, you're done. It's over. And so we need to take a look at that. Also, in the Old Testament as well, if there was a rape that was committed, in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22 beginning, we see that if it was a damsel that was betrothed or a married woman, the penalty was death for both parties if, it was conditional, if they were in the city, it was death for both parties because the woman didn't cry out. But if it was out in the country, it was only death of the man in the rape. Both were held guilty under the Old Testament if the woman didn't scream out for help or cry out, the text says. But if it was in the country where there was nobody to hear her, if she cried out, then she got off. But the guy was to be killed. For a damsel that was not betrothed, I tell you what, this would make you zip up all your clothes. Because if you were not betrothed, the girl's father was paid 50 shekels, and the man had to marry the woman. Can you imagine marrying a rapist? But that was the penalty under the old law, the consequence, and there was a damage fee that was paid here in the amount of 50 shekels. Fornication with a maiden that included whoredom is spoken about in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And the penalty there was death, except for a maiden that was a virgin. And then look again, she was to marry the man. So if we have immorality or whoredom going on, if it's the first time for her, she's got to get married. Now, the term bestiality, I'm hoping most of you don't know what that is, but my fear is that you do. And what this is sex with animals. It's a form of great perversion. It is something spread all over the internet if you want to go out there and watch that. And if you do, I hope God gets you. I really do. Because this stuff is sick stuff, I want to tell you. But bestiality, the consequence for that, if you're trying to have sex with animals, having animals mess with you, or you messing with them, the consequence is death for both the person and the animal. God just does not want that perpetrated whatsoever, and anybody knows anything about that has done that, what he says is death. That knowledge is not to be passed on. Then in the terms of sodomy, again in Leviticus 20 and verse 12, what we find is the penalty is that both men were to be killed, or both parties were to be killed. Now there were some other things in the Old Testament that involved sexual laws. That is, in terms of marriage, a brother's widow. And by the way, you want to be sure who your brother is going to be marrying, because guess what? Or you want to be sure which brother you marry, I should say. Because if the guy you marry ends up dying, then you have to marry his brother. And if he dies, you have to marry the next brother. I don't know what kind of families y'all come from, but some brothers are not the kind you want to be married to. So you better look real close at that family if you're living under the law. Aren't you glad you don't live under this law? You know, they're brothers. I'm looking women up. All right. Fathers and sons were forbidden to be with the same woman sexually. They could not cohabit together, and what this says is it is confusion. And then in Deuteronomy, we see cross-dressing being condemned. This would be be wearing that which pertains to man wearing girls' clothes, and women wearing men's clothes. Now there's a form of eroticism that's exactly what this is talking about, kind of getting off on other people's clothes. And wearing other people's garments, especially undergarments, is what's under consideration here. And what the point is that men are to be men and women are to be women, and you don't run around in the opposite person's underwear or other kinds of clothes. You just don't do that. And if you do, then God says there's a consequence of that. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. A woman who is suspected of adultery, in Numbers the 15th chapter, there are some consequences there about how that there was some checks they put in place. I won't go into detail of that, but there was checks they put in place. If a man says, "My wife's been unfaithful to me," he's better be able to prove it. And if he could prove it, then it was death for her. But if he could not prove it, then he could never divorce her. You better be sure before you accuse somebody, according to that passage. Deuteronomy 22, a bride that was suspected that she had been unfaithful, if the tokens of her virginity were not present, then there would be death by stoning. Tokens of her virginity has to do with the female anatomy being broken during the first intercourse. And if that's not there, if that token's not there, then she was to be put to death. That would make you be real careful even about how you conduct yourself in regular life, because that anatomy can be damaged in other ways. But the Old Testament law is very clear on these. Eunuchs and illegitimates. Now, eunuchs were men who had been castrated. And we read about those throughout the Bible, but for one reason or another, usually these were servants that if they were working around the house, if you didn't want to mess with the women, then what would happen is the servants sometimes would be castrated. If you'll read the book of Daniel, you'll find such was the case with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I want to tell you, when I read that and realize what had been done to them, I have even more respect for the fact that these guys weren't bitter. And a lot of guys would be pretty bitter if somebody taken them and mutilated them like that. But not so. Those four faithful men who realized that you could serve God even though you lose your reproductive ability. Eunuchs and illegitimates were forbidden to marry. And you know what? That even makes me look at the New Testament a little different, because I read about the Ethiopian eunuch over in the New Testament. And you know what? He was forbidden to go in the congregation of people. And here's what this means. This means this man traveled 3,000 miles in a chariot across desert land in order to stand outside while other folks worship. And we can't even get him in the building. Now that's dedication. Balaam had some diabolical advice. Well, I should say the 10th Commandment law, thou shalt not commit adultery. Balaam was trying, remember him, he was trying to place a curse upon God's people, and every time he tried, God blessed him. And what he said is, well, I'll tell you what, if you will, if you can work against them, if you will go send your women in there to seduce the guys in the camp, I can't curse them, but God will. And so let's set this up to where we have these foreign women going into camp and seducing the people of God. And I want you to look at how rampant this thing got. There were 23,000 men that were killed in that, as well as the women that came in there to cohabit with them. God's people evidently had not learned the lesson that they were to be faithful in their marriage relationships, and they were to be faithful to the law of God, and that sex outside of marriage would result in death, or at least penalty of the penalty you had to marry. But they evidently weren't looking at that. God brought about again the death penalty. When I go to David and Bathsheba, I am just a little bit have a couple of questions in my mind that we'll ask God, Jesus, when he comes back about this, after we get through our other long list of things to ask him. But here David had violated the 10 Commandment law. And that is that adultery, the 10 Commandment law required him to be put to death, as well as Bathsheba, who was an adulteress. And for whatever reason, God made an exception in David's case. I'm sure I don't understand that. But what I do know is that after this, with David and Bathsheba, that they were different. And I want to suggest this to you, that once we have cohabited with someone that we have no right to, we are never the same again. There will always be that memory that lingers within the person's mind. Those who dare to violate God's sexual laws will pay a very dear price, even in our day and time. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But after sexual sins, no one is ever the same again. You cannot go back once you've crossed that line. There was a man named Jochebed, and he had some fantasies. And in this case, I believe the fantasies were about his sister. And I believe that's the case. And in this one, what we find is that he was fantasizing about his half-sister, which would have been an issue in the law of Moses. And what he did is he took some very diabolical advice on how to seduce and ultimately have sex with his sister. And he actually involved his father in the manipulative plot to do that. And ultimately, you know what happened? The text says that after he did this, again, you're never the same. That after he did this, it says, the hatred wherewith he hated her is greater than the love wherewith he loved her. This man thought he was in love. He just had the hots. And what happened is, once he committed the act of immorality, then what happened is that he had a disdain for this woman. A disdain. And ultimately, it resulted in his own death by the other full-blood brother who came out and avenged his sister's rape. There are warnings about making oneself vulnerable, and warnings about seduction, and I'm not going to have time in this lesson to read these passages, but I tell you what, I was well into marriage before I even realized these were in the Bible, so I don't want you to be there when you realize they're in the Bible. So I want to turn to the book of Proverbs just a moment, and I want to just highlight some things in here. In the second chapter of Proverbs, actually the first 10 chapters are dialogue. And after that, we have the little vignettes with the ones and twosies, Proverbs. But in the second chapter, verse 16 through 19, the ways of wisdom, this is your wisdom literature, by the way. If you like wisdom, go to Proverbs. That's wisdom literature for you. Where Proverbs 2, verse 16 through 19, what we see here is that the ways of wisdom are given to deliver thee from the strange woman, or the whore, is literally the translation, even from the foreigner that flatters with her lips. Now look at the seduction. That we start out by sweet talking. Sweet talking, this is seduction. That forsakes the friend of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. This is the woman that's cheating on her mate. And for her house inclines unto death, and her paths unto the dead. Know that none that go in unto her return again, neither do they attain unto the paths of life. Now I want you to look at that real closely, because what it says is that if you're out here and you've got the lust in your heart, and someone is trying to turn you on and get you all excited, what it says when you go in into her, that's clear, isn't it? We understand what that is. When you go into her, you're never the same again. You'll never be able to return to the status where you were. And I'll tell you what, this will haunt your life and your dreams. And here's why. You remember that old amygdala I talked about the other night? If you've ever done it, it's stored in there. And it'll pop in at the strangest times. So even after later on, when you finally decide to settle out in your life and you get married, guess what's happening when you're having with your wife? Something triggers that thought, and here comes that vision up again. You're never the same again. And don't think your mate won't know that. There's a third person in bed with you. Don't think ever they won't know that. In Proverbs, the 5th chapter, the first 14 verses, there again he talks about that earlier. He talked about the young man who was wily, who was foolish, and he was seeking a woman who was wily in heart, deceitful in heart. And there it talks about the whole seduction scene, how he goes down the street trying to find her, and then she seduces him, and they cohabit. And then it talks about the vengeance of the husband. I want you to look at Proverbs 5, verse 19, just a moment. It says, "As a hind and a pleasant doe, let me read, just go back to verse 2. It's talking about verse 15. Drink waters out of thine own cistern. He uses an analogy here that of your wife, and he says, drink waters out of your own cistern, and running waters out of your own well. Should thy springs be dispersed abroad, and streams of water in the streets? What he's saying is, you don't go around being sexual just all over the streets. You don't go out here hunting for mates or people to be sexual with. He says, let them be for thyself alone, and not for strangers with thee. In other words, you guard your sexuality. Let thy fountain be blessed. And look at this, guys, and rejoice in the wife of thy youth. Life happens to us when we're married. And often the person that we marry doesn't end up looking the same as it did when we married. Children come along, life takes place, and guess what, guys? You're not the same you that you were when you got married. You don't believe that? Look in the mirror. You're not the same. You may not be that handsome hunk she chose. And guess what? It's going to get worse as you get older. But what he says here is that don't be out here looking for a new model just because your wife is putting some years on, just like you are. That what you do is rejoice in the wife of thy youth. Now look at the next verse. He gets plain here. As a loving hind and a pleasant doe, let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. That word ravish means to be delighted. That you are the best thing that's ever happened to me. That's how you treat your wife. That's how you view your wife. And you don't go out here, we're going to talk in the next session about going out here looking out for somebody else, trying to see what we missed. You don't even do that. I tell you what, when you get married, the shop is closed. You don't even win the shop. We'll talk more about that in just a few moments. But the passage here tells us very clearly, and why should thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman. Here's somebody you don't have any right to. And why would you go out here and try to satisfy yourself sexually with someone that you have no right to? And you can read on through there, and it's going to tell you a whole bunch more about that. Spend some time in those Proverbs. And that's why we've given you these handouts. Spend some time with these verses. But what we see is that what we see also here is that there are strong warnings about making yourself vulnerable, and also about seduction. That's in these verses. Being satisfied with the wife of your youth. Now I want to go to the Song of Solomon. Has anyone here ever studied the Song of Solomon? Does anybody know that's in the Bible? Well, guess what? It isn't there by accident. Now actually, the Song of Solomon, to give you a little preface here, the Song of Solomon is a stage play. And what you're reading is script of different parties in this stage play. And I'm going to leave that so that we don't spend our whole time tonight running through the details of some of this. But it's a stage play. If you'll read it with that in mind, what you'll see is there's different people speaking through there. And you can kind of just break that out. It's a stage play. Well, in the Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 1 through 6, here's what we have. We have a young woman that's madly in love with a shepherd boy. They're both country people. But what's happened is that Solomon's group has come through, and here's these guys that are looking to make Solomon's harem bigger and bigger, so they're trying to find all the cute girls. This is the short version. They're trying to find all the cute girls. And so as they do, they see this beautiful woman out in the field, and so they just grab her, take her, clean her up, and they're going to give her to the king, so he'll be happy because he's got another woman in his harem. And by the way, what Solomon would want with 1,000 women, I have no idea. Most of you guys are going to say amen. One's plenty, isn't it? But don't say too much amen. You may sleep on the couch tonight. All right, Song of Solomon, chapter 4, 1 through 6. And here's what he says. Here's what it says. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. That's poetry. You see that. Thine eyes are as doves behind thy veil. Thy hair as a flock of goats. I don't know that I'd use that for a romantic line, but that evidently somebody, they thought that was nice back then. That lie between the sides of the mountains. Thy teeth are like a flock of ewes that are newly shorn, which are come up out of the washing, whereof every one hath twins, and none is bereaved among them. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet, and thy mouth is comely. Thy temples are like a piece of pomegranate behind thy neck. Behind thy veil. Thy neck is like the Tower of David. And he goes on, and then he describes even the breast here in verse 5, and he goes on down. Now, if you want to notice something and look at that in its context, that's not her boyfriend talking. That's the guy that thinks that she's pretty hot. And he's describing her, but look at the terms he's describing her. Oh, you got the most voluptuous lips. Well, I tell you what, man, you got a shake on you. That's what he's saying. He is looking at this woman not for her inner beauty, but he is looking at this woman from the standpoint of a sex object that you can excite and entertain me. Now, you know what? She didn't buy it. She didn't buy it. You read on in this stage play, and what you find is that even though she's been taken against her will, taken to the king's palace, ultimately what happens is that her love for this young shepherd boy, her love wins out, and finally the king realizes, I can have her, but I'll never have her heart. And what he does is he does a very honorable thing. He turns her loose, and she goes back home to the love of her life. Who's ever read it? Read it. And what you'll see in this book is the difference between lust and true love. Here's one guy that's got the hots for her, and another guy truly loves her. And here she is warding off the guy that wants to perpetrate with her, and she's dreaming about the guy she loves. And you want to talk about that? That'd make a good movie. And it even be scripture. Wouldn't that be nice? All right. Well, I tell you what, ultimately what happens is that there is honor in this, and then there's some advice in the last part of this. When I say family takes care of family, in the Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 8 and 9, it says this, talks about true love. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man would give all the substance of his house for love, he would utterly be condemned. All right? And what that's saying is, you can't buy love. Any sugar daddies in the audience? Don't raise your hand. Any sugar mamas in the audience? You can't buy love. I'll tell you what, see guys, sometimes as we get older, we might get the idea that we want to look young and we want somebody on our arm that's a little younger than we are. And we may want to be tempted to go out and do whatever. And the point here is, you can't buy love. Now what you can buy is whoredom. And what you can buy is immorality, but you can't buy love. And I'll tell you what, we already talked about poor stewardship. That's not what you spend your money on, or where you turn your attention. When you're not married, the shop is closed, period. Now here's a family that watches out for this, they've got a younger sister, and the brothers now say, well, we have a little sister, and she has no breast. What that means is she's not developed yet. And what shall we do for our sister in the day she should be spoken for? And here's the question. What the brothers are asking, well, we've got another sister coming on, and she's not quite of age yet. What do we need to do with her? And here's the next passage. Here's the answer. The first brother asks the question in verse 8. The next brother answers in verse 9. If she be a wall, we will build upon her turquoise of silver. In other words, if she has the ability, like a wall, to say, no, I'm not going to be immoral, then you decorate her with silver. What has she done? If she be a door, everybody knows doors, what you go through. So here she says, well, come on, let's get it on here. And if that's the way she is, look what the brothers are going to do. We will enclose her with boards of cedar. We'll build a closet, put her in a closet. I don't recommend that you hide your secrets in the closet. But what it says is, we're going to watch that this doesn't happen, because it's going to disgrace our family. Now I'll tell you what, that was a day and time when family watched out for family. I'll tell you what it used to be, and I'm old school, I know to many of you, but I'll tell you what the time was where you defended your sister's honor. And you watched who it was your sister was going out with. Anybody remember those days? Family protected family. And we did that for a reason, because the next generation coming on, we don't want them a bunch of mongrels. The sister's been with everybody, all that stuff, and on Father's Day, everybody's confused because we don't know who Mama's daddy is. Because everybody's confused. You talk about confusion out on the countryside. And you just have Father's Day when you got all kinds of fathers joining in to see their kid, and that's confusion. There were some other sexual laws out there in the Old Testament. We talked about these things, but by the time we get to the Old Testament, there's actually a book on a woman that cheated on her husband, and it's the book of Hosea. Did you know that's in the Old Testament? And what we have here is a prophet of God, a very godly man. And God gave him a command that he gave no other person I know of. He commanded this man to go and marry a woman who was a prostitute. Take her out of whoredom, is the way the text says. Her name was Gomer. That's not Gomer Pyle, that's Gomer the woman. And Gomer and Hosea had a marriage. And the first marriage, there was a child. At first in the marriage, there was a child came along, and this definitely was their child, no question about it. Second child came along, Hosea started to think about this, and he's like, is that my kid? And the third kid comes along, he says, this one's not mine. This isn't my kid. And ultimately what happens is Gomer leaves, and she is sold into slavery, and then ultimately Hosea takes her back. The irony in that, he takes her back, but he does not dwell with her as his wife until she has proven herself to be reputable and to have repented and straightened her act out. Now, there's some lessons there in terms of infidelity in marriages today. And should we get back with our partner at all costs? There's some lessons in Hosea that will well be worth reading. I don't have time to develop develop that tonight, but we do need to be aware of Hosea and lessons that are there for us from God's holy word. Now, in the New Testament, we see that there are some significant terms. The word lust is used in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 27 through 30. And there it talks about that you've heard of old, that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Now we all know that passage, but what does it mean? It has to do with looking for the purpose of lusting. This is not a casual glance. This is not an observational glance that somebody came in the room and we see something that we wish we hadn't seen, or that might entice us. But what this is talking about is the person that has eyes full of adultery, that is out here looking for the opportunity, looking to lust. I tell you, the first time you see them, it may just be casual. But if you take that second look, you better be looking real careful, because this may well have to do with lust. This passage specifically forbids us lusting after one another. And also here we're told about fornication, that we're not to commit fornication. In Matthew the 5th chapter, verse 32. By the way, I'm going to go through some of these in a little bit of detail. If y'all know anybody in the area that's wondered about my positional marriage or about my past life, I want you to be able to show them this. And I'm going to just take a minute for this, if that's all right. But I want to suggest to you in Matthew the 5th chapter and verse 32, the passage says, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that everyone that puts away his wife, save for the cause of fornication, makes her an adulteress. And whosoever shall marry her when she is put away commits adultery. Do you see that there's a very serious consequence here to violating your marriage vow? And what the passage clearly tells us is that we are not to put away our mates. But if you do, that you put them away for the cause that is specified here, the cause of fornication. By the way, that word fornication is the general term for sexual unfaithfulness. It could include sex out with someone that is not married by a married person, or it may include other types of immorality. I would see in that also any kind of fornication, which may include homosexuality. Because I read in the book of Jude, I believe it is, that the word fornication used and applied to the people of the city of Sodom. And the word fornication is used there for what they were doing. It was sexual unfaithfulness. And so it says, whosoever marries her when she's put away commits adultery. Now, by the time I get over to the 19th chapter, or the 9th chapter of the book of Matthew, I'm reading about adultery and about the marriage laws. The 19th chapter of Matthew. I'm reading about the marriage laws. And the question is being asked, is it lawful to put away your wife for every cause? And what is very clearly stated here is verse 9, whosoever shall put away his wife, except for fornication, there it is again, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And he that marries her when she is put away, commits adultery. Here's God's plan. One man for one woman for life. The door is closed. Your marriage is to last until death do you part. The only exception to that, the only exception to that, is if there is unfaithfulness on the part of one party. And then if there is an innocent party, then that party may remarry. And I won't develop that again a little bit later on. But also, we see the book of Romans condemns adultery in Romans the 13th chapter and verse 9. By the way, the passage about homosexuality being referred to as sodomy is Jude verse 7. Lasciviousness is described as a work of the flesh, and those that practice such shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. In 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, verse 3 and 4, there it is talked about as the lasciviousness of the folks there. And later on, what we read is those with eyes full of adultery, that what is reserved for them is the blackness of darkness. And we have the such lights. We have lost some terms in our vocabulary in this century. And one of the terms is the term for illegitimate children. And the Bible calls them bastards. And that's God's term. In the book of Hebrews, the 12th chapter, verse 8, there it talks about the comparison of a child born in a natural setting between husband and wife, and how that child is treated different than an illegitimate child. And by the way, there were laws in the Old Testament that we didn't look at tonight about how you treat, or about the treatment, God's treatment of children that were born outside of wedlock, or as the Old Testament refers to them as bastard children. That's a term that's not a complimentary term. God, and some of the confusion we have in our day and time is because of the immorality that's going on among God's people and among the world. And what we have is a bunch of illegitimate children going around. Some of them don't know who their daddies are. One such person came to me in a counseling session and told me, I finally found out who my dad is. And her dad happened to be a gospel preacher from years back, and I use gospel preacher very loosely with him. But in our session, what I recommended is, does he know that you're alive? And she said, yes. And I said, have you ever talked with him? And she said, yes. I said, what was his response? And she said, he looked me in the eye so cold, Art, and then she began crying. And she said, he told me, you're not my child, you're just the result of a night passion. You think that wouldn't hurt? How'd you like growing up thinking your daddy thought that about you? Such is the case, and way too many cases. Whoremongers are talked about in the Bible, and what we're told is that we're not to be whoremongers. In passages there, such as 1 Timothy 1, verse 9 through 11. And then again, sodomy. And in Romans 1, verse 26 through 28, the passage there says 3 times, for this cause God gave them up. As far as I know, those are the saddest words to me in the Bible, besides, depart from me, I never knew you. But can you imagine how, with the God we serve, how hard it is for God to just give up on folks? For this cause, God gave them up, to burn in their lust one toward another, man with man, woman with woman, doing those things that are unseemly. For this cause, God gave them up. I want to talk with you just a moment about marriage, and we'll have more to say about this in our next lesson, or in our lesson tomorrow on home. But in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 through 7, I'm talking to married people now, and we'll talk real plainly to you. What this says in this passage, you can read it for yourself. But what the passage says is that husbands and wives are not to defraud one another. That means that when one of you wants to cohabit, the other one needs to cooperate. Okay? You need to work this out. Otherwise, what happens is that if you decide that you want to kind of stay away from each other for a little bit sexually, then that needs to be by a mutual consent according to that context. That's not a decision of one party. That's a mutual consent, but it's for a reason. And notice the reason. Uh-oh, here it comes again. You hear it? That you may give yourself to fasting and prayer. See that coming again at you? And what that depicts is that sometimes there in marriages are rocky roads. Anybody's married knows that. Whoever thought marriage would be happily ever after must have been writing a fairy tale. Because there are definitely some times that we're not happily ever after. But I tell you what, during those rocky roads, what you do is you don't pull apart, you pull together. You know how you do that? You invite God into the problem. Actually, he should have been in it all along, because he's part of the solution, if not the solution. And what this passage says is that there's a time that husbands and wives need to be talking to God about what's going on in the marriage. And I believe if we would have more families that would talk to God about these things, then we would have God as a partner in the home, and actually God as the head of the home, and the husband as the subhead. Well, you read that for yourself. The violation of the marriage vow is so serious. Stepping outside of your marriage, folks, is so serious that God allows one reason and one reason only for divorce and remarriage. And here's the passage. You ever read Malachi, the 2nd chapter, verse 16? I'm sure you've heard it cited. And it says, "For I hate putting away, says Jehovah, the God of Israel. And he that covereth his garment with violence, saith the Lord, therefore take heed to your spirit, that you deal not treacherously." Now in that passage, when he says, "I hate putting away," God is saying, I hate divorce. I do too. Divorce is a gift that you never want. It keeps on giving and giving and giving. And it never goes away. I hate divorce. But there's something God hates worse than divorce. And that's a cheating mate. And therefore, what God does is He allows the very thing He hates because He hates a cheating mate more. That's how serious God is at. Someday I may talk to you about living through divorce and the consequence. That'll be another lesson. God's regulations to single persons are also very clear in the Scriptures. In 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about the parents of a virgin daughter and how they need to deal with their daughter who wants to marry. And he's talking here about a time of present distress, but nevertheless he's given some principles. I want to look now at 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 through 8, and I want to suggest to you this is one of the strongest verses in the New Testament on watching out for taking care of ourselves. And this kind of segues into our next lecture just a little bit. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 through 8. Here's what he says. "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification." Look at this. Whatever he's talking about, it's his will, and it's what sets us apart from the world. Look, "that you abstain from fornication." Now look at this, verse 4. "That each one of you know how to possess himself of his own vessel in sanctification and honor." Your Bible may read a little bit differently, but that word that says possessing your own vessel in sanctification and honor, what he is talking about there, and I'm going to be very clear with you, is he's talking about your sex organs. And he's saying you possess your sexual organs in sanctification and holiness. They don't belong to anybody else to mess with except your mate. And he says that's your sanctification in the Lord. Look at how he underlines this now. Underscores it. "Not in the passion of lust, even as the Gentiles who know not God, that no man transgress and wrong his brother in this matter." Look at this. "Because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as also we forewarned you and testified." What did he say? He says that your sex organs are to be protected. And they are not for everybody to fondle or to be a part of. They are for you and for your married mate only, and for no one else. And what he says, this is your sanctification. And look at this, he threatened you. Did you see that threat in verse 6? That the Lord is an avenger in all these things. You want to get in a war with God, you cheat on your mate. And see if the whole world doesn't come down on you. And the church too. Possess your vessel in honor. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18 through 20. He says, "Flee fornication." And says that those that commit fornication sin against their own body, which, if I remember our verse last night, said had been bought with a price. "Beware of people, places, and things that open you to seduction. Somebody invites you to go to the party where everybody's dressing hoochie, and you want to dress hoochie and go to the party, don't go. That's not where the Christian goes. You know what hoochie is? Don't go. You know, I knew that word. All right. But don't go to places like that. Possess your vessel in honor. The body is not for fornication, but it's for the Lord, 1 Corinthians 6:3. And then what he tells us very clearly, in the Las Vegas of New Testament times, the city of Corinth, what he says is, you come out from among them, and you be separate, says the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing. And then I will be your father, and you will be my sons and daughters. Romans, the first chapter, verse 31 and 32, he talks there about those that are without natural affection. And then I want you to look at something in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14, and I'm going to wrap up with these next two verses, well, the next three verses. In 2 Peter, the second chapter, if you don't believe that evil men and seducers wax worse and worse, then look at this verse, because it tells us very clearly. And what he says here in verse 13, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, it should say 13 instead of 14, or it says 14. And he talks about those that are blemishes and who revel in their deceivings while they feast with you. And then look at verse 14. Having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, enticing unsteadfast souls. You see that? Having eyes full of, this is the person, man or woman, that can't even walk in a room without checking everybody out to see how hot they are. That's what that's about. Now look at this next one. Having eyes full of adultery. And look at this scary statement here. That cannot cease from sin. Cannot. That means have lost the ability to be able to have a clean thought. If you'll read down a little bit, what you will see is what's reserved for them is called the blackness of darkness. And he's talking about a hell of fire there. You know, you can go so far in looking outside of a marriage realm, that you know you can go so far that it's impossible to stop. That's what that verse is about, isn't it? Beware. Evil men and seducers will wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Now that whole context is 2 Peter 2. Talks about those who are the blackness of darkness, there in verse 17. And it talks about being overcome in verse 19. And then that's where the context of the dog turned again to his own vomit, and the sow was washed in water and mire. That's the context of that verse that we've heard quoted so much. Read that. And read it in its context. And what you'll see is this is describing people who dare to go back on God's will, and who dare to have eyes full of adultery, who dare to have immorality and vulgarity and looseness in their thoughts, sexual looseness. Now what it says is God's got a special place if that's what you're going to do. So how did you learn about the facts of life? You see, God's Word has all kinds of things. Now, I'll tell you what. When I read a passage in Deuteronomy that says that we're supposed to teach God's Word to our children, how are your children learning about the facts of life? Now, let me suggest this, that this isn't about a talk. A talk is better than nothing. But it is about training our child up in the ways of God, where we learn the difference between men and women, and we're not letting them feed on the world from what their friends are telling them, or what they're learning through some nasty book, or by some porn site. If our children are going to learn how to be moral and honest, moral and have integrity, moral and realize that sexuality belongs in marriage, then they're going to have to learn it for us, because the world's not going to tell them that. I think it is high time for God's children to begin teaching God's will on this subject. It is time that we become knowledgeable, because Satan is already halfway around the world and we don't even have our shoes on.